Good evening all, and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I bring you 8 accounts that have been locked away in the court records and case files of Southern Illinois, stories that investigators hoped would fade into obscurity but refused to stay silent. In this episode, we will journey through the backroads, forgotten churches, and shadowed forests of Southern Illinois, where 8 individuals encountered darkness they could not explain and horror they could not escape. These narratives have been meticulously reconstructed from official police reports, court testimonies, and first-hand accounts of those who witnessed events that shattered their understanding of human nature. To honor the privacy of victims and their families, certain identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the terrifying authenticity of what transpired. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Paranoia Files for daily true horror content that pulls back the veil on the cases they do not want you to remember. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when darkness returns with another collection of stories that prove sometimes the most disturbing monsters are the ones who walk among us unseen. I am writing this because no one will listen anymore. March of 2019 was when I stopped being a search and rescue volunteer in Southern Illinois, when I traded my hiking boots and GPS unit for a desk job that keeps me far away from the dense pine forests that stretch across the Shawnee National Forest. People ask why I gave up something I was passionate about for 8 years. Why I abandoned a team that relied on my tracking skills and knowledge of those treacherous trails near Garden of the Gods. I tell them my knees cannot handle the terrain anymore, that I needed steadier income, that I wanted more time with family. But those are comfortable lies that let me sleep at night without explaining what we found that Sunday morning, what we did not find, and what the evidence suggested about a man who chose to walk into the forest and never intended to return. I was 34 years old when it happened, already considered one of the more experienced volunteers on our SAR team despite never having formal wilderness training. What I had was instinct, an understanding of how lost hikers think, how panic makes them move in circles, how desperation drives them toward water sources or elevation where they hope someone might see them. Over those 8 years, I had participated in 47 search operations. We found 39 people alive, 6 deceased from exposure or injury, and 2 we never located despite weeks of searching. Those 2 failures haunted me, kept me volunteering long after other members retired or moved away. I needed to believe that persistence and proper grid searching could solve any disappearance, that the forest always gave up its secrets eventually if you looked hard enough and long enough. Michael changed that belief, shattered it completely. Because what we discovered was not the aftermath of someone getting lost and succumbing to the elements. It was evidence of someone who planned their disappearance with meticulous detail, who left a trail of breadcrumbs that led us exactly where he wanted us to go, and who vanished into a mystery that had been claiming people from these woods for over 2 decades. The call came through dispatch at 6:47 on a Sunday morning in mid-March. Temperature was still hovering around 38 degrees, frost clinging to everything, the kind of morning where your breath creates clouds and your fingers go numb within minutes of stepping outside. A hiker had been reported overdue by his roommate. Michael had told people he was taking a solo day hike on Saturday, planning to do the 5-mile river-to-river trail loop that started near Pounds Hollow Lake, one of the more popular moderate difficulty trails in the area. He should have returned Saturday evening. His roommate became concerned when Michael did not show up for their usual Sunday morning coffee run and was not answering calls or texts. Park rangers located Michael's vehicle within 20 minutes of the initial report. A black Honda CR-V parked at the designated trailhead, positioned perfectly within the marked parking space. No signs of any struggle or hasty departure. The keys were still in the ignition, engine cold, clearly parked there at least 12 hours based on the frost accumulation. His phone was on the dashboard showing 47% battery remaining. Wallet in the center console with his driver's license, credit cards, and $83 in cash. Registration and insurance papers in the glove box exactly where they should be. Everything about the vehicle suggested normalcy, a routine hiking trip by someone who planned to return, except for one detail that the responding ranger noted in his initial report. The doors were unlocked. Not just unlocked, but all 4 doors, which struck him as unusual given the remote location and the fact that Michael had left valuables inside. Most hikers lock their vehicles out of habit, even in low-crime areas. It was a small inconsistency, easily explained by forgetfulness or comfort with the area, but it was the first crack in the appearance of normalcy. Our SAR team assembled by 8:30 that morning. 12 volunteers plus 3 park rangers and a deputy from the county sheriff's office. Standard protocol for a missing hiker: establish a command post at the trailhead, divide into 3-person teams, conduct systematic grid searches radiating outward from the last known position, which in this case was the parking lot where his vehicle sat. We assumed Michael had started on the marked trail, so our initial search focused on that 5-mile loop and the immediate surrounding areas where someone might wander off path. Team Alpha, which included myself and 2 other experienced volunteers named Robert and Christine, took the primary trail heading east toward the river overlook. The morning sun was beginning to burn off the frost, creating a mist that hung between the pine trees and made visibility difficult beyond 50 yards. We walked slowly, calling Michael's name every few minutes, scanning the undergrowth for any signs of disturbance, broken branches, scuffed leaves, anything suggesting someone had moved through the area recently. We found his backpack at 9:15, approximately 200 yards into the forest along the marked trail. It was positioned upright against the base of a large oak tree, not thrown or dropped, but carefully placed as if someone had gently set it down while taking a rest. The positioning was deliberate, intentional, impossible to miss for anyone walking the trail. Inside, we found everything a responsible day hiker would carry. 2 bottles of water still sealed, energy bars, a first aid kit, a trail map of the area, a small flashlight, and his wallet, which we had initially thought was in his car but turned out to be a duplicate he carried while hiking. There was also a journal, one of those weather-resistant notebooks that hikers use to document their trips. Christine flipped through the journal while Robert radioed our find to the command post. The entries were typical hiking observations. Notes about trail conditions, wildlife sightings, photographs he had taken on previous trips. But the most recent entry, dated the previous day, was different. It was not about the trail or the scenery. It was 3 sentences that made my stomach tighten even before I fully processed what they meant. I can finally hear them clearly now. The invitation has been extended. It is time to accept what I have been called to do. We continued searching, moving more carefully now, because something about that journal entry and the positioned backpack suggested this was not a standard lost hiker situation. 50 yards further, we found one of his hiking boots. Then 30 yards after that, the second boot. Both were placed in the center of the trail, not tossed aside or lost during frantic movement, but positioned deliberately like markers. Another 40 yards and we found his jacket folded and placed on a fallen log. Robert, who had been volunteering even longer than I had, stopped walking and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face during searches. It was recognition mixed with dread. He said one word: undressing. It is a phenomenon that happens sometimes with severe hypothermia. Victims become confused and paradoxically feel overheated, leading them to remove their clothing. But the morning Michael disappeared had not been cold enough for hypothermia, not for someone properly dressed on a short day hike, and the way the items were placed, the careful positioning, suggested clear thinking, not confusion. We radioed for additional support and continued following the trail of belongings. A water bottle here, his GPS watch there, each item placed like breadcrumbs guiding us deeper into the forest away from the marked trail. We were now in an area I had never searched before, dense undergrowth with no clear paths, the kind of terrain where you had to push through branches and step carefully to avoid turning an ankle on hidden roots and rocks. That is when Christine spotted the cave entrance. It was partially obscured by thick brush and fallen branches, a narrow opening in a limestone outcropping that would be invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. Fresh scratches on the rocks around the entrance suggested someone had recently cleared away vegetation to make the opening more accessible. We approached cautiously, flashlights out, calling Michael's name but no longer expecting a response. The cave was shallow, maybe 20 feet deep, with a low ceiling that required crouching to navigate. Inside, we found evidence that Michael had spent significant time there, possibly hours. A makeshift camp with a blanket that did not match anything we had inventoried from his backpack, suggesting he had brought supplies specifically for this purpose. Dozens of symbols carved into the soft limestone walls, geometric patterns and shapes that looked like some form of language or code. His GPS watch that we had found earlier outside turned out to have a twin inside the cave, positioned carefully on a flat rock. But what disturbed me most was the small digital recorder sitting in the center of the cave floor, red recording light still blinking. Robert picked it up and pressed play. Michael's voice filled the small space, calm and measured, explaining in detail what he was about to do. He described having dreams for the past 6 months about something he called the ones who walk between. Entities he claimed existed in the spaces humans could not normally perceive. He said they had been calling to him, showing him coordinates in his dreams, coordinates that led to this exact location in the Shawnee Forest. He described a belief that certain people were chosen to leave the physical world behind and join these entities in what he called the space between breaths and heartbeats. The recording lasted 17 minutes. In it, Michael calmly laid out his entire plan. How he would leave his vehicle unlocked so it could be found quickly. How he would position his belongings to lead searchers to this cave. How he wanted people to know he was not running from anything or hiding from anyone. He was accepting an invitation he believed was sacred and transformative. He described specific instructions he claimed to have received about where to go next. Coordinates he repeated 3 times to ensure they were captured on the recording. He ended the recording by saying he understood most people would think he had experienced a psychotic break, but he felt more clarity and purpose than he ever had in his entire life. Then the recording stopped. We immediately radioed those coordinates to the command post. They led to an abandoned limestone quarry about 3 miles northeast of our position, an area that had been closed to the public since the late 1990s after several accidents. By the time we hiked there and additional teams arrived, it was early afternoon. What we found at that quarry changed everything I thought I understood about missing persons cases in the Shawnee Forest. There were 6 vehicles scattered around the quarry's perimeter, hidden in various states of decay among the trees and overgrown vegetation. An old Chevrolet pickup truck with 1998 registration tags, a Ford sedan from 2003, a Jeep from 2007, a Subaru from 2011, a Mazda from 2015, and a Toyota from 2017. All had been reported as belonging to individuals who had disappeared while hiking in the Shawnee National Forest over the past 21 years. All had been intensively searched for and never found. All showed the same pattern. Keys left behind or placed deliberately, personal belongings scattered like trails, no signs of struggle or violence, just vanishings. Law enforcement began an intensive investigation of the entire quarry area and the surrounding forest. They found symbols carved into trees matching those in Michael's cave. They found remnants of campsites in various states of age. They found journals and notes from multiple individuals describing similar experiences. Dreams about being called, invitations to join something greater, coordinates received through visions or voices. But they never found any human remains. Not Michael's, not any of the 7 previous missing persons whose vehicles we recovered. No bodies, no bones, no evidence that anyone had died at that location. What they did find eventually was an extensive digital trail. Michael's internet history revealed he had been active on an obscure online forum dedicated to something called Forest Ascension. The forum had been operating on the dark web for over a decade, with hundreds of members discussing experiences of being called to specific wilderness locations, of receiving coordinates through dreams, of preparing to leave the material world behind. The forum moderators used sophisticated encryption and moved the site regularly to avoid detection. Federal investigators eventually traced the operation to 3 individuals running what they determined was a cult recruitment network, targeting vulnerable people with history of depression, social isolation, or spiritual seeking. The 3 operators were arrested and charged with fraud and conspiracy, but not murder. There was no evidence anyone had been harmed, no proof that the missing individuals had not simply walked away from their lives voluntarily. The prosecutors argued that the cult leaders had manipulated vulnerable people into abandoning everything and disappearing, possibly to join a commune or compound that investigators never located. The defense argued that adults have the right to walk away from their lives if they choose, that there was no coercion, just a shared belief system, however unconventional. Michael was never found. Neither were the 7 others whose vehicles we discovered that day. The case remains officially classified as missing persons, not homicides, not kidnappings, just unexplained disappearances. The families hold an annual vigil at the Garden of the Gods overlook every March, still hoping someone will come forward with information, still believing their loved ones might one day return. I do not volunteer for search and rescue anymore. I cannot walk those trails without hearing my radio that morning, without remembering Michael's voice on that recording describing his invitation with such calm certainty. The forest keeps its secrets, and now I know that some people do not want to be found. They want to disappear into something bigger than themselves, even if that something might not exist anywhere except in the carefully constructed mythology of predators who understand exactly how to exploit human longing for meaning and transcendence. That knowledge sits heavy in my chest like a stone, and I cannot carry it into those woods anymore. Some searches end without answers, and sometimes the absence of answers is the most disturbing discovery of all. I have reviewed the case files 300 times, maybe more. When you work as a criminal psychologist for the Illinois State Police, you tell yourself that repetition brings clarity, that enough passes through the same horror will blunt its edge. Instead, with this case, every read-through cuts a little deeper. People assume I left the department because of burnout, too many years in the trenches of violent crime. That is easier to accept than the truth, which is that one quiet man from Carbondale in a storage unit full of boxes dismantled the way I look at every face I pass on the street. Before I met him, I thought I understood serial predators. I had profiled rage killers who exploded like hand grenades, spree killers who burned their lives down in a few frantic days, and the methodical planners who treated murder like a craft to be refined. I believe their motives were messy combinations of anger, trauma, sexual compulsion, and power fantasies. But this man, who lived 10 minutes from the Southern Illinois University campus and taught ethics to freshmen, insisted his murders were not about pleasure or hatred. He said they were about documentation. That word stayed with me. Documentation. As if these people were not victims, but data points. The case began with a smell, like so many do. September of 2016, late heat still clinging to Carbondale, humidity turning the air thick enough to drink. A landlord received complaints about a sour chemical odor seeping from one of the storage units he rented behind his small apartment complex. The unit was listed under a name that meant nothing to him, some generic alias used for privacy. The tenant was always punctual with payments, always polite, requested no maintenance, no favors, no discounts. They almost did not cut the lock. They almost chalked it up to a dead raccoon or old garbage. The maintenance man sliced through the lock at 4:37 p.m. The time sticks because it became the first entry in a chain of timestamps that would define the case. Inside the unit, stacked with almost ritual precision, were 47 identical cardboard boxes. Each box had a white label on the front in neat, even handwriting. A name, a date, 2 sets of numbers in 24-hour format. That was it. No decorations, no scribbles, no chaos. Just order. The first officers on scene opened the top box on the nearest stack. Inside, cushioned with layers of acid-free tissue paper like a museum artifact, was a collection of personal items. A student ID card, 2 pieces of jewelry, a phone case with stickers on the back, a worn textbook with highlighted passages, a bus pass with punch marks. No body parts, no blood, nothing overtly violent, just the curated remnants of a life interrupted. At the very bottom lay a spiral notebook, labeled with the same name and date as the box. The notebook was not a diary, it was a study. 14 pages of observations written in clinical language, the subject's daily route from dorm to library to part-time job, the time she preferred to eat, what she ordered, how long she lingered over her food, notes on posture, eye contact, the way she held her pen. Tiny details no one else would ever care about, recorded in a tone that never once acknowledged the subject as a person with inner life. She was an object, and he was cataloging her. The second box held similar items from a different person. So did the third. By the time the detectives reached box 12, a sick pattern had emerged. The names on the labels matched missing persons reports, almost all students from the university or recent graduates. The dates aligned with the days they were last seen. Those strings of numbers? The first set matched the rough time of last confirmed sighting. The second set would turn out to be their estimated times of death. He was not just collecting keepsakes, he was curating last days. I was brought in the following morning once the scope of what they had uncovered became clear. At that point, they did not yet know whose unit it was. The payments had been made through an online service, the alias tied to a prepaid card. But the storage facility's security camera, covered in dust and ignored for years, still worked well enough to capture images. We watched the footage together in a cramped office that smelled of old coffee and mildew. There he was, always arriving alone, always in the same nondescript jacket and baseball cap, always carrying one box at a time with both hands, as carefully as if he were holding a glass sculpture. The timestamps on the footage ran from October 2005 to August 2016. 11 years of visits, usually late at night, usually on days that later matched missing persons reports. The pixelated quality of the footage did nothing to soften the chill that ran through me as I watched him slide a box onto the growing stacks and step back, as if admiring his work. When we finally linked the rental paperwork to a real identity, the name meant nothing at first. Daniel H. Carbondale, resident, age 41, associate professor of philosophy at the university. Emphasis: ethics and moral responsibility. Ethics. He was arrested at his small ranch-style house on a quiet residential street. His lawn was neatly trimmed, trash cans aligned perfectly along the side of the driveway. His neighbors described him as polite and reserved. Students later said he was demanding but fair, notoriously strict about deadlines, fascinated with thought experiments about trolley problems and moral trade-offs. No one had ever seen him raise his voice. The first time I sat across from him in the interview room, I felt like I was talking to a surgeon between operations. Calm, alert, analytical. He did not ask why he had been arrested. He did not protest. He asked very politely if he could have his glasses cleaned because he wanted to see everyone clearly. It was the only request he made in the entire first session. I began with open questions, as I always do. Tell me about your work, your students, your research. He answered easily, even warmly, when he described certain classes he enjoyed teaching. Ethics, he said, fascinated him because it forced people to examine the assumptions they build their lives on. Most people, he believed, never looked closely at why they considered some lives more valuable than others. When I asked about the storage unit, he did not flinch. He nodded once and said, "Ah, you found the collection." I remember choosing my next words carefully. The collection of what? Last days, he said. Oh, not lives. Lives are sprawling and unfocused. I was interested in conclusion points. The moment a life as a continuous narrative becomes fixed in retrospect. To some, that answer might sound like deflection or madness. To me, it sounded horrifyingly lucid. I had read enough of his notebooks by then to know he meant every word. For 11 years, he had been choosing people, observing them in obsessive detail, and then orchestrating their disappearances so that he could stand at the threshold between their ordinary existence and whatever came after. The pattern his notes revealed was chilling in its precision. Every victim had taken his ethics course and failed it. That was his initial filter. Not because he was angry at them, but because he believed their failure indicated a lack of engagement with moral questions. They were, in his view, people moving through life on autopilot. People who had never truly considered the value of their own existence. I wanted to create a control group of unexamined lives, he told me during our third interview. People who believed themselves to be moral simply because they obeyed laws and avoided discomfort. I was curious how they would respond when confronted with their own ending in an undeniable, immediate way. He called it the Human Conclusion Project. He did not stalk them in the way popular media likes to portray. There were no dramatic break-ins, no stalking through windows. He studied patterns. He learned where they felt safe, which late-night walks they took alone, which shortcuts they preferred, which friend's apartment they left at predictable times after study sessions. When he finally made contact, it was always under the guise of familiarity. A professor offering a ride in bad weather, a neighbor appearing at just the right moment when a car would not start, a chance encounter at a coffee shop turning into a walk home. The journals described the progression with revolting calm. First contact, establishment of trust, choice of location, preparation of what he called the interview space. He did not torture them, at least not physically. There were no recorded acts of sadism. What he did instead was sit them down in that space, sometimes a rented basement, sometimes a remote cabin outside town, and begin a series of recorded conversations about death. He asked them if they believed their life had meaning, whether they thought, given the chance, they had done anything that justified continuing to exist, whether they believed any higher power would notice if they vanished. He did not threaten them directly at first, but the space, the isolation, and his absolute control of the environment made the stakes clear. By the time he revealed that they would not be leaving alive, most had already cycled through denial and anger and landed somewhere between bargaining and numb shock. In every recording we recovered, and there were dozens, the moment of realization sounded almost the same. Breathing quickening, a soft no repeated, then a question about family or someone they loved. He documented these shifts with academic detachment. "The fear response is nearly universal," one entry read, "but the content of their last statements is where genuine moral hierarchy emerges." Some focus entirely on self-preservation. Others think first of those they care about. A smaller fraction still worry about the impact on the broader world. The pattern is fascinating. 7 bodies were eventually recovered from shallow graves outside town and from wooded areas across southern Illinois. He had chosen locations with care, places where hunters might stumble across remains years later, adding another layer of chance to his experiment. In each case, items he did not deem essential to his documentation had been discarded. But anything that spoke to their identity, the things they wore every day, items with sentimental value, objects they touched in those final hours, went into the boxes. He thought of those boxes as a library. When I asked him why he had kept them in such pristine condition instead of destroying evidence, he looked genuinely confused. "Oh, I never planned to hide the collection forever," he said. "What is the value of documentation if no one ever studies it? Eventually, someone was going to open that door. I assumed it would be a curious landlord after my death. It seems it happened sooner." I could have believed he was simply rationalizing, that he had been caught off guard and was inventing an intellectual justification after the fact. But his computer told a different story. Hidden among legitimate academic files were outlines for a future publication. Not for a textbook or journal article, but for what looked like a manifesto. He had titled it, "On the Ethics of Conclusion," a study in unexamined lives. Large sections were already drafted referencing anonymized subjects whose profiles lined up perfectly with the people in those boxes. The university disowned him publicly within hours of his arrest. His colleagues claimed to be shocked, baffled, devastated. Yet when we combed through his published work from the past decade, we found disturbing hints that no one had caught. Footnotes describing the moral irrelevance of hypothetical suffering that sounded harmless in an academic context until you realized he no longer saw people as hypotheticals. Passages about the responsibility of the observer to press on the boundaries of ethical comfort in order to reveal hidden truths. He had mentioned, in obscure online forums, a small group of like-minded academics who believed that real psychological understanding required field work beyond traditional ethics. 2 of those names later surfaced in unrelated investigations out of state, both involving missing persons and suspiciously detailed case notes. It was not a formal network, not a cult in the traditional sense, but there were threads connecting them. Shared language, shared fascination with final moments. In the end, he was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping. There were 47 boxes. We may never know whether the remaining names belong to people he targeted but never successfully abducted, or victims whose bodies have yet to be found. In court, he wore the same calm expression I had seen in the interview room. He showed no remorse, only mild irritation when the prosecution mischaracterized his motives. "Their lives were always going to end," he said in his allocution statement. "I observed the process, that is all. If you do not like what you see in my documentation, perhaps you should question the nature of human response to mortality, not the fact that someone recorded it." After his sentencing, I requested a transfer out of active profiling. On paper, it was for health reasons. I moved into teaching, lecturing younger officers about behavioral analysis and interview strategies. They think my voice cracks when I talk about certain cases because of old stress. The truth is simpler and far more unsettling. Once you have seen someone reduce human beings to data so thoroughly, you start catching yourself doing smaller versions of the same thing. I watch my students differently now. I notice who sits where, who laughs too loudly, who never speaks. I catch myself wondering who would freeze in the interview space and who would fight until the end. I hate that those questions even form in my mind. That is his legacy, more than the boxes, more than the graves. He infected the way I look at people, turned my professional detachment into something I no longer fully trust. People like to believe monsters announce themselves, that there are tells, obvious signs, some aura of danger that warns you to stay away. But the man who spent 11 years collecting last days never raised his voice in class, never got into bar fights, never waved a gun around on social media. He graded papers, attended faculty meetings, made small talk at the coffee shop, and in his spare time he documented conclusions. I still wake up some nights thinking about those boxes in the evidence locker, each one a life reduced to objects and ink, frozen at the moment before everything became memory. I know we did our job. We stopped him. We brought closure to families who had spent years in the agony of not knowing. But there is a part of me that cannot stop replaying his words in that cold interview room. The way he leaned forward and said almost conspiratorially, "You of all people should understand, Daniel. Is it not your job to study them too?" That was the moment I realized I could not sit across from men like him anymore. Because the line between studying evil and becoming fascinated by it is thinner than most people want to admit. He crossed it completely. I stepped back from it just in time, but I will never again be certain where that line really is. This is transcript number 47 from my interview with Abigail. I am Detective Madison with the Marion Police Department, and I have been in law enforcement for 16 years. I have sat across from liars, from rage-filled spouses who snapped after years of building resentment, from addicts who killed for money they needed in that desperate moment. What you need to understand about Abigail is that she was not insane. She did not hear voices commanding her to act. She was completely lucid, rational even, when she explained why she helped 11 people drown themselves in Crab Orchard Lake. That lucidity, that calm conviction in her voice, is what made it so much worse than any confession I had heard before. The first body surfaced on a Tuesday morning in early June of 2018, a fisherman out before dawn, trying to beat the heat that was already building. Even at 5:30 in the morning, saw something white caught in the reeds near the eastern shore. At first he thought it was a tarp or maybe a discarded sail from one of the small boats that frequented the lake. When he got closer, he realized it was fabric, ceremonial robes like you might see in a baptism or a church ritual. The body inside those robes was a woman in her mid-30s. The medical examiner would later determine she had drowned, but what disturbed him most were the rocks. Heavy stones had been sewn into the pockets of the robes, 6 pounds on each side, deliberately weighing her down so she could not float even if some survival instinct kicked in and made her try. By Thursday afternoon, 3 more bodies had surfaced. The lake was not that deep in most areas, and the summer heat was accelerating decomposition, causing the bodies to bloat and rise despite the weighted robes. All 4 victims wore identical white ceremonial garments. All 4 had stones sewn into hidden pockets. All 4 showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication they had fought their killers. The autopsies revealed mild sedatives in their systems, nothing strong enough to render them unconscious, just enough to dull panic and make them compliant. The investigation moved quickly once we identified the first victim through dental records. Her name was Rebecca, and she had been reported missing by her sister 3 weeks prior. The sister told us Rebecca had joined something called the Purified Light, a small religious group that met in an abandoned church building near Lake of Egypt, about 20 miles from where the bodies were found. The church had been decommissioned in the 1980s, sold to private owners, and had sat mostly empty until Abigail Fisher took over the lease in 2015. Abigail was 38 years old, a former registered nurse who had worked in pediatric oncology until her daughter drowned in a swimming pool accident in 2014. According to friends and family, she had never fully recovered from that loss. She stopped working, withdrew from social circles, and eventually started what she described as a grief support group for people who had lost loved ones to water-related deaths. That group, over the course of 3 years, morphed into something much darker. When we raided the church on Friday morning, we found 8 people still living there. They were gaunt, malnourished, their eyes hollow but strangely peaceful. The church had been converted into a communal living space with sleeping mats on the floor, a single bathroom, and a kitchen area where they prepared meals consisting almost entirely of bread and water. The windows were covered in handwritten scripture verses, but not from any Bible I recognized. These were Abigail's own writings, her interpretations of baptism and purification and transcendence through drowning. Abigail did not resist arrest. She stood calmly in the center of the main room while officers secured the building and escorted the remaining members outside. She asked only if she could retrieve her journal, a thick leather-bound book she had been keeping since her daughter's death. We allowed her to take it, and later, that journal would become the most damning piece of evidence in the case. The entries began as you might expect from a grieving mother. Raw pain. Questions about why her daughter had to die. Reflections on the randomness of tragedy. But around month 6, the tone shifted. She started writing about revelations she claimed to receive in dreams. Visions of her daughter not dead but transformed, existing in what she called the water space, a realm between life and death where those who drowned were not lost but elevated to a higher state of being. By year 2, she had fully constructed a belief system around this idea. Drowning, she wrote, was not death. It was transcendence. The panic, the struggle, the gasping for air, those were the impurities being expelled, the last remnants of earthly fear being purged. If you could surrender completely, if you could let the water fill your lungs without fighting, you would emerge on the other side as something pure, something angelic. She began recruiting through online grief forums, specifically targeting people who had lost loved ones to drowning. She offered them community, understanding, and eventually the promise of reunion. If you crossed over the same way your loved one did, she told them, you would find them waiting on the other side. She called it the Great Crossing. The 8 survivors we pulled from that church were in various stages of psychological conditioning. Some were lucid enough to realize what they had narrowly escaped. Others were devastated that we had interrupted the ceremony they had been preparing for. One woman, in her early 20s, sobbed and begged us to let her go back, insisting her brother was waiting for her in the water and she had failed him by not completing the ritual. The final ceremony had been planned for that Sunday. Abigail intended to lead all 11 remaining members to Crab Orchard Lake at dawn. They would wade into the water together, wearing the weighted robes she had sewn by hand, and they would submerge themselves while singing hymns she had composed. Abigail had prepared everything meticulously. The location, the timing, even the dosage of sedatives mixed into the communion wine they drank the night before. What we found on her computer was even more disturbing. She had been in contact with 2 other group leaders, one in Kentucky and one in Missouri, both running similar operations with nearly identical rhetoric about water ascension and purification through drowning. They shared recruitment strategies, discussed which types of people were most receptive to the message, and encouraged each other when doubt crept in. Between the 3 groups, we estimated at least 27 people had participated in crossing ceremonies over the past 4 years. Most of those bodies were never recovered. During my interviews with Abigail, I kept searching for some crack in her facade, some moment where she would break down and admit she knew what she had done was murder. It never came. She maintained, with disturbing consistency, that she had helped those people achieve peace. When I asked why she had not crossed with them, why she had stayed behind if she truly believed in this transcendence, she smiled. It was not a cruel smile or a mocking one. It was gentle, almost maternal. "Someone has to stay behind to guide the next group," she said. "There are so many people suffering, so many who need to understand that death is not the end. I cannot abandon them just because I am ready to cross." That statement haunted me more than anything else. She saw herself as a shepherd, a guide, a compassionate leader helping lost souls find their way home. The prosecution argued for first-degree murder charges, but without clear evidence of force or coercion, the best they could secure was 11 counts of involuntary manslaughter. The defense successfully argued that the victims had participated willingly, that they had written letters expressing their desire to undergo the ceremony, that they had been adults capable of making their own choices, however tragic. Abigail was sentenced to 40 years. "She will likely die in prison." When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she stood and addressed the families of the victims. She told them their loved ones were at peace now, that they had crossed successfully, that they should feel comfort knowing the suffering was over. Several family members had to be escorted from the courtroom. I requested a transfer after the trial ended. I could not continue working homicide cases in that district, could not drive past that church or that lake without seeing those weighted robes, without hearing Abigail's calm voice explaining her theology of drowning. What disturbs me most is not her delusion. It is how easily grief can be weaponized by someone with just enough charisma and conviction. She did not need to threaten anyone. She did not need to use force. She simply offered people what they desperately wanted, a way to make sense of unbearable loss and a promise that death was not an ending but a reunion. 8 people are alive today because we raided that church when we did. But 5 of them still write to Abigail in prison. They send her letters thanking her for showing them the truth, apologizing for not being strong enough to complete the crossing, asking when they might try again. That is what keeps me awake at night, the knowledge that even now, even after everything, she still has followers who believe. And I wonder how many other Abigails are out there right now, in other small towns, in other abandoned churches, weaving the same promises to people who are too broken to see the danger until the water is already closing over their heads. Evidence log, case number 2017-4445. I am Trooper Andrew Barnes with the Illinois State Police District 13. I am recording this because the official reports do not capture what actually happened on Route 13 between Marion and Harrisburg on the night of October 31st, 2017. The paperwork will say equipment malfunction. The psychological evaluations will reference mass suggestion and environmental factors. But 17 of us saw the same thing that night, heard the same transmissions, felt the same impossible cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. And not one of us can explain it in a way that makes sense to anyone who was not there. I had been with the state police for 9 years by that Halloween, comfortable enough with the rural routes and the late shifts that most of the younger troopers tried to avoid. Route 13 was part of my regular patrol, a stretch of 2-lane highway cutting through farmland and patches of forest between small towns that shut down after dark. It was usually quiet, the kind of shift where you might pull over one speeding truck driver or help someone with a flat tire, but mostly you just drove and watched the mile markers pass. The first 911 call came in at 11:43 p.m. A woman reported seeing an overturned semi-truck on Route 13, approximately 2 miles east of the Williamson County line. She said the driver was outside the cab, waving his arms for help, and there was heavy fog making it difficult to see clearly. Dispatch sent out the call, and I responded along with 3 other units who happened to be in the area. The weather report had not mentioned fog. In fact, it had specifically called for clear skies and unseasonably warm temperatures for late October. I arrived first, exactly 12 minutes after the initial call. The fog was there, thick and wrong, the kind that seems to have weight and texture clinging to everything. My headlights barely penetrated it. I could see the semi about 30 yards ahead, tilted at an angle consistent with a rollover accident. I radioed my arrival and stepped out of my vehicle, reaching for my flashlight and medical kit out of habit. The other units arrived within minutes. We approached the semi together, calling out to ask if anyone needed assistance. No response. When we got close enough to touch the truck, we realized something was deeply wrong. There were no fresh tire marks on the asphalt, no debris field, no shattered glass or spilled cargo. The truck itself was covered in rust, the paint faded and peeling, the tires flat and rotted. This was not a fresh accident. This truck had been here for years, maybe decades. I ran the VIN number while my colleagues searched the immediate area for the driver who had supposedly been waving for help. Dispatch came back with information that made my hands go cold. The truck had been reported stolen in 1982, 35 years earlier. The registered owner was listed as Victoria Long, a long-haul trucker who had disappeared the same night the truck was stolen. She had been driving Route 13 when she called in to report mechanical trouble. Her last known location was mile marker 47, exactly where we were standing. That is when the fog intensified. It rolled in thicker, and with it came a cold that had no business existing on a 60-degree October night. I could see my breath. We all could. The temperature on my patrol car's external thermometer dropped from 58 degrees to 41 in less than 3 minutes. And then the radios started acting up. At first it was just static, the normal interference you sometimes get in rural areas with spotty tower coverage. But then, cutting through the static came a voice. A woman's voice, distorted and distant, like it was traveling through water or being played on damaged equipment. She was calling for help, giving her location on Route 13, describing a breakdown and asking for assistance. The background noise behind her voice included music, faint but distinct, the kind of 1980s pop rock that would have been on the radio during that era. All 4 of our radios picked up the transmission simultaneously. Dispatch confirmed they were not broadcasting anything. The voice did not match any active call. When one of the other troopers, a veteran named Richard, asked dispatch to play back the recording from the original 1982 missing persons case, the similarities were unmistakable. Cadence, pitch, phrasing, even the specific words used to describe the location. It was Victoria Long's voice, or something that sounded exactly like it. Then our body cameras started malfunctioning, all 4 of them at the same time. The screens went to static, the audio cutting out, the timestamp displays flickering and jumping between current time and dates in 1982. We tried switching them off and back on. Nothing worked. The cameras just kept recording static while we stood there in that impossible fog, listening to a dead woman's voice repeat her call for help. One of the officers, a younger trooper named James who had only been on the force for 18 months, said he saw something moving in the fog. A figure, human-shaped but indistinct, walking between our vehicles. We all turned to look, flashlights cutting through the dense air, and for just a moment I swear I saw her too. A woman in clothing that looked decades out of style, standing near the overturned truck, staring at us with an expression I could not read. Then the fog shifted and she was gone. The voice on the radio suddenly changed. Instead of the repeating call for help, Victoria began giving specific directions. Turn around, go back west, mile marker 47, look beside the road. Right side, the ditch. Please, you have to look. I do not know why we followed the instructions. Protocol said we should have called for additional support, should have waited for supervisors and maybe a psychological evaluation team because clearly something was wrong with all of us. But something about that voice, the desperate clarity in it, made me get back in my patrol car and drive exactly where she told us to go. Mile marker 47 was less than half a mile back the way we had come. The fog lifted as suddenly as it had appeared. One moment we were driving through soup, visibility maybe 20 feet. The next moment the air was clear, temperature back to normal, our radios functioning perfectly. Our body cameras resumed normal operation as if nothing had happened. We pulled over at mile marker 47 and searched the right side of the road. The ditch there was overgrown with weeds and small bushes, the kind of vegetation that grows when an area has been undisturbed for years. But when we walked down into it, following the line where water runoff had recently eroded the soil, we found something that recent erosion had exposed. Bone. Human bone, partially uncovered by water damage, clearly buried there for a significant period of time. I called for the forensic team in the coroner's office. By sunrise, they had excavated a complete set of remains that dental records would later confirm belonged to Victoria Long. The medical examiner determined she had died from blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck with a heavy object. This was not an accident. This was homicide. The property adjacent to that stretch of Route 13 belonged to a man named Matthew Cooper, 71 years old, who had owned a small truck stop in the area during the 1980s. The truck stop had closed in 1990, and Matthew had been living alone on the property ever since. When investigators searched his land with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, they found evidence of 4 additional burial sites. Matthew confessed within hours of being confronted with the evidence. He described a pattern that had lasted from 1982 until 1990, using fake distress calls over CB radio to lure truck drivers to remote sections of Route 13, robbing them, killing them when they resisted or threatened to report him, and burying the bodies on his property. He claimed to have stopped after a religious conversion experience in 1990, insisting he had spent the last 27 years trying to atone through prayer and charity work. 5 victims in total were recovered and identified. Victoria was the first, but there were 3 other long-haul truckers and 1 traveling salesman, all people who had disappeared between 1982 and 1990. All cases that had gone cold decades ago. Matthew was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was convicted at age 71 and sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. He died in prison 8 months later from a heart attack. The official report attributes the events of that Halloween night to equipment malfunction caused by atmospheric conditions. The fog, they said, created optical illusions. The radio interference was explained as signal bounce from a nearby tower maintenance issue. The body camera failures were attributed to a software glitch affecting that particular model. The fact that all 17 of us heard Victoria's voice giving us directions to her gravesite is mentioned only in the psychological debriefing notes filed away as a shared stress response to an unusual situation. But I was there. I heard her voice. I watched my body camera display flicker between 2017 and 1982. I saw that figure in the fog, and I will swear until the day I die that Victoria Long led us to her own remains that night. The erosion that exposed her grave happened to occur during the week leading up to October 31st. Halloween. 35 years to the day after Matthew Cooper killed her and buried her in that ditch. I still patrol Route 13. I drive past mile marker 47 at least twice a week during my regular shifts. But I do not stop there anymore, not even for routine checks. The official explanation satisfied the department and closed the case. The families got closure after decades of not knowing. Justice, delayed by 35 years, was finally served. But late at night, when I am driving that stretch of highway alone and the fog starts to roll in, I turn my radio down low and listen. Because part of me wonders if Victoria was the only one trying to communicate that night, or if there are others still out there on Route 13 waiting for someone to notice them, waiting for someone to look in the right place at the right time and finally bring them home. Some cases solve themselves in ways that defy logical explanation. You can call it coincidence, or equipment failure, or shared delusion if that helps you sleep at night. But 17 trained law enforcement officers do not all hallucinate the same detailed sequence of events. We did not find that grave because of good police work or advanced forensic techniques. We found it because a dead woman told us where to look, and on the 35th anniversary of her murder, we finally listened. Social Services Report, case number SW 2019-0883. Client, Natalie Morris, age 67, reported by concerned neighbors for hoarding conditions and possible self-neglect. I am the assigned caseworker, and what began as a routine wellness check at 44447 Sycamore Lane in Murfreesboro became something I cannot adequately document in official paperwork without sounding like I have lost my grip on reality. This is my personal account of what we found in that house, what we could not find, and what still defies every rational explanation I have tried to construct in the 5 years since. The initial complaint came from the neighbor directly to the east, an older gentleman named Harold who had lived on that street for 40 years. He reported that Natalie had been talking to empty rooms, leaving food out for a daughter who did not exist, and setting the table for 2 people every evening despite living alone since her husband's death in 2015. Harold emphasized he was not trying to cause trouble, but he was worried about her mental state and thought someone should check on her welfare. I arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August with a police officer for safety protocol, standard procedure for wellness checks when mental health concerns are involved. The house was a small ranch-style home with faded yellow siding and overgrown landscaping. Nothing about the exterior suggested crisis or neglect. The lawn had been mowed recently. The mailbox was not overflowing. There were no visible signs of hoarding or property damage. Natalie answered the door on the second knock, a small woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a floral print dress that looked freshly laundered. She was polite if slightly confused about why we were there, and invited us inside without hesitation. The living room was clean and organized. No stacks of newspapers, no piles of garbage, none of the typical indicators of severe self-neglect. But there were other details that immediately caught my attention. 2 coffee cups sat on the side table, both recently used, one with lipstick marks in a shade far too young for Natalie. A pair of women's sneakers by the door, size 7, modern style, clearly not belonging to someone in their late 60s. A jacket hanging on the coat rack that would fit a woman in her 30s, not Natalie's size or generation. When I asked about the second coffee cup, Natalie smiled and said her daughter had just left for work. Emma worked the night shift at a factory across town, she explained, so they usually had their morning coffee together before Emma went to sleep. She spoke about Emma with the casual familiarity of someone discussing a person they saw every day, mentioning small details about Emma's preferences and habits with the kind of specificity that comes from intimate daily contact. The officer and I exchanged glances. I had reviewed the case file before arriving. Natalie had one daughter, Emma Peterson, who disappeared at age 9 in 1994. The case had never been solved. Emma would be 34 years old now if she were still alive. I asked Natalie if I could speak with Emma, perhaps call her at work to verify everything was all right. Natalie's expression shifted, becoming protective and slightly defensive. She said Emma was very shy around strangers, preferred not to be disturbed during work hours, and besides, what was this really about? Was someone spreading rumors about her? We spent the next hour conducting the wellness assessment, checking the kitchen, bathroom, bedrooms. Everything appeared normal, almost too normal, until we reached the second bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was partially open, and inside was a fully furnished room for a young woman. But not a child's room. This was decorated for an adult in her 30s. Modern bedding, contemporary clothing hanging in the closet sized for an adult woman, makeup and toiletries on the dresser, a laptop computer on the desk. The bed was unmade, as if someone had recently slept in it. Clothing lay draped over a chair. On the desk were papers, bills, and documents with Emma Morris's name and signature. A work badge for Riverside Manufacturing was clipped to a lanyard hanging from the desk lamp. The room showed clear signs of recent occupation. Natalie stood in the doorway and sighed, saying Emma was terrible about making her bed and always left her room messy. She said it with the exasperated affection of a mother dealing with a grown child who still lived at home. There was no hint of delusion in her voice, no awareness that anything about this situation was unusual. The officer ran a check on Emma Morris while we continued the assessment. What he found complicated everything. There was an active employee record for Emma Morris at Riverside Manufacturing. She had been working there for 6 months, always on the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Time cards showed consistent clock-ins and work completion. But the payroll address listed was Natalie's home, and the social security number associated with the employment was flagged as potentially fraudulent. We contacted the factory. The manager confirmed they had an employee named Emma Morris, reliable worker, never caused problems, always completed her assignments. But when we asked if anyone had actually seen her, met her in person, or could describe her appearance, the responses became vague. The night shift supervisor said she mostly kept to herself, came in through the employee entrance, worked in the packaging area where it was loud and people did not socialize much. No one could definitively confirm they had spoken with her face-to-face or could describe specific features. Security camera footage from the factory was even more disturbing. During Emma's supposed shift hours, doors in her work area opened and closed on their own. Equipment operated. Tasks were completed. Packages moved along conveyor belts. But the cameras never captured a human figure, not once in 6 months of footage. At Natalie's house, we set up a subtle surveillance camera in the common areas with her reluctant permission, framing it as a safety measure. Over the next week, we documented similar phenomena. Doors opening and closing, lights turning on in Emma's room, the shower running in the morning hours when Emma supposedly came home from work, food disappearing from the refrigerator, but never a human form on camera. The handwriting on Emma's employment paperwork, her supposed signature on documents, matched samples from Emma's childhood schoolwork we obtained from the 1994 case file. 9-year-old Emma's handwriting matured slightly but still fundamentally the same. We reopened Emma's disappearance case. A detective I will not name here, out of respect for his own trauma from the investigation, interviewed Natalie extensively. She had no memory of her husband harming Emma. She insisted Emma had grown up normally, attended school, had friends, graduated, got a job. When confronted with evidence that Emma had been missing since 1994, Natalie became distressed and confused, insisting we were lying to her that Emma had just been in the kitchen that morning. A witness came forward during the reinvestigation, a terminally ill man who had been Natalie's husband's brother. He said he had suspected for years that his brother had hurt Emma, that the girl's sudden disappearance and his brother's evasive explanations never sat right with him. But he had stayed quiet out of family loyalty and fear. Now, facing his own death, he wanted to clear his conscience. The search of the property was authorized 3 weeks after the initial wellness check. Ground-penetrating radar identified a disturbance in the basement floor beneath what had been finished with concrete sometime in the mid-1990s. When the forensic team excavated, they found skeletal remains that dental records confirmed belonged to Emma Peterson. The medical examiner determined the death occurred shortly after her disappearance in 1994, approximately 25 years earlier. Natalie's husband had killed their daughter. We never determined exactly why, whether it was intentional or an accident that he covered up. He had taken that truth to his grave in 2015. And Natalie, unable to process the loss, had constructed an elaborate alternate reality where Emma simply continued growing up. The psychiatric evaluation revealed severe dissociative disorder. At some point after Emma's death, Natalie's mind had broken from reality and created a protective delusion so complete that she genuinely believed Emma was alive. Over the years, that delusion had expanded and evolved. Emma aged in Natalie's mind, became an adult, got a job, lived a full life. The fraud charges related to the factory employment were complicated because Natalie herself had been doing the work during dissociative episodes, going to the factory during night shifts, performing the tasks, signing the time cards, all while believing she was Emma. The handwriting matching Emma's childhood script was because Natalie had unconsciously mimicked her daughter's penmanship when writing as Emma. The food disappearing, the unmade bed, the clothing worn and then discarded, all Natalie during fugue states acting out the presence of her daughter. But none of that explains what I saw, what the cameras recorded, what cannot be rationalized through psychology textbooks. Doors opening with no one there, showers running in empty rooms, work completed at a factory with no visible human presence. I have read every psychiatric evaluation, every expert opinion about dissociation and elaborate delusion. They explain Natalie's behavior. They do not explain the phenomena that occurred independent of her presence. Natalie was deemed incompetent to stand trial for the fraud charges. She was placed in a psychiatric care facility where she remains today. The doctors say she has made no progress. She still believes Emma is alive, still asks when her daughter will visit, still sets aside portions of her meals for Emma to eat later. I requested a transfer to a different district after the case closed. I could not continue doing home visits in that area, could not drive past that house on Sycamore Lane without remembering what I witnessed. The official explanation is dissociative identity disorder with elaborate delusion. The cameras malfunctioned due to equipment issues. The factory phenomena were explained as staff not paying close attention to who was actually doing the work. But I was there when that bedroom door closed on its own while Natalie was sitting in the living room with us. I saw the drawings dated 2019 in handwriting that matched a 9-year-old child who died 25 years earlier. I watched security footage of packaging work being completed in an area where no human form appeared on camera. The psychological explanations account for Natalie's actions and beliefs. They do not account for everything else. And that distinction, that gap between what can be explained and what defies explanation is what made me realize I could not do this work anymore. Some cases have clear answers. Some have tragic but understandable psychological components. And then there are cases like Natalie Morris, where grief created something that even after finding the body, even after establishing the timeline, even after psychiatric intervention, still operates by rules we do not understand. Emma Peterson died in 1994. Her remains were buried in that basement for 25 years. But something in that house on Sycamore Lane continued opening doors and completing work shifts long after her death. Whether that was purely the manifestation of a mother's profound denial or something else entirely is a question I am no longer qualified to answer. I only know that some absences refuse to stay absent and some daughters never really leave home. Traffic Incident Analysis Report, Southern Illinois Corridor, 2014 through 2018. I am Joshua Simmons with the Illinois Department of Transportation Traffic Safety Division. My job for the past 11 years has been studying accident patterns to improve road safety, identifying dangerous intersections, recommending improvements to signage and lighting, analyzing data that most people would find numbingly boring. Numbers and coordinates and collision reports that tell stories if you know how to read them. What I discovered in the data from Highway 146 was not about road conditions or poor visibility or driver error. It was about a predator who had turned a 40-mile stretch of rural highway into his personal hunting ground. And the pattern he left behind was written in statistical anomalies that no one else had noticed. The pattern first appeared in my quarterly analysis in January of 2018. I was running standard reports on single-vehicle accidents, the kind where there is no other car involved, just a driver who loses control or swerves off the road. Highway 146 between Golconda and Harrisburg had 17 such incidents over the previous 4 years. That number alone was not particularly unusual for a rural 2-lane highway with curves and wildlife crossings. What caught my attention was the demographics. All 17 accidents involved women between the ages of 23 and 35. All occurred during nighttime hours between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. All involved drivers traveling alone. And in 16 of the 17 cases, the driver reported the same thing in their statement to responding officers. They had swerved to avoid a man standing in the middle of the roadway. I pulled the individual reports and read through them carefully. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A man, average height and build, wearing dark clothing, standing motionless in the center of the lane. The drivers would brake hard and swerve, often ending up in a ditch or colliding with trees along the shoulder. By the time they got out of their vehicles or by the time emergency responders arrived, the man was gone. Officers would search the area and find nothing. No pedestrian, no broken down vehicle nearby that might explain why someone would be standing in the road, no evidence anyone had been there at all. The reports were filed as wildlife avoidance or driver error or possible hallucination from fatigue. No pattern was noted because the incidents were spread across 4 years and handled by different officers in different jurisdictions. But when you put them all together on a map, they formed a cluster along Highway 146, concentrated in a 15-mile stretch where the road ran through particularly isolated terrain with minimal lighting and long distances between houses. I started cross-referencing other databases, looking for anything else unusual in that corridor during the same time period. That is when I found the missing persons cases. 9 women had disappeared from the Highway 146 area between 2015 and 2017. All were in their 20s or early 30s. All were last seen at gas stations or rest areas along the highway. All had been traveling alone. The security camera footage from those gas stations, where it still existed, showed something that made my stomach turn. In 6 of the 9 cases, cameras had captured a male figure approaching the women's vehicles while they were inside the convenience store paying for gas. The footage quality was poor, typical for rural gas station security systems, but you could see him doing something near their gas tanks or engine compartments. The timestamp showed the women would return to their cars, drive away, and that was the last anyone saw of them. I contacted the Illinois State Police with my findings. They assigned a detective who initially seemed skeptical that a traffic analyst had stumbled onto something their missing persons unit had missed. But when I showed him the mapped pattern, the timeline correlation, and the security footage, his skepticism turned to focused intensity. Within a week, they had identified a suspect. His name was Joshua, the same first name as mine, a detail that disturbed me more than it should have. Joshua S., age 44, a long-haul trucker who ran regular routes through southern Illinois. His home address changed frequently, always small towns along Highway 146, always month-to-month rentals or extended-stay motels. He had no criminal record beyond a few traffic violations, nothing that would flag him in any database. But his truck logs, which commercial drivers are required to maintain, showed he had been on Highway 146 during the time frame of every single disappearance and most of the accidents. The state police set up an undercover operation. A female officer, roughly the same age and appearance as the missing women, posed as a stranded motorist on Highway 146 on a Wednesday night in February. Her vehicle was positioned on the shoulder with the hood up, emergency flashers on, in a location that matched the pattern of previous incidents. Surveillance teams were positioned at multiple points along the highway, ready to intervene. Joshua's truck appeared within 8 minutes. He pulled over, approached the officer with a friendly demeanor, and offered assistance. She explained that her car had died unexpectedly and she could not get cell reception to call for help. He offered her a ride to the next town where she could get help. She accepted, following protocol, and got into his truck cab. He drove past the next town, kept driving, heading away from populated areas, but making turns onto progressively smaller roads. The officer maintained her cover, acting nervous but not panicked, while backup units tracked them via GPS. When she asked where they were going, he told her he knew a mechanic who could help her even at this late hour. Someone who owed him a favor. Backup units intercepted the truck on a gravel road about 12 miles from where he had picked her up. When they opened the cab, they found chloroform-soaked rags in the glove compartment, zip ties under the seat, and a small black bag containing duct tape, rope, and a syringe filled with what would later be identified as a powerful sedative. In the sleeper compartment behind the cab, they found what he called his hunting kit. Photographs of women, some matching the missing persons reports, personal items, jewelry, driver's licenses, phones, and a handwritten journal describing each encounter in clinical detail. The search of his current residence, a rented property outside Elizabethtown, revealed a shipping container buried partially underground in the woods behind the house. Inside that container was a soundproofed room with a mattress, restraints bolted to the walls, and evidence that people had been held there for extended periods. DNA evidence eventually linked the container to 3 of the missing women. Joshua confessed to 7 murders. He described a methodology that was horrifyingly simple. He would identify vulnerable travelers through CB radio chatter, listening for truckers who mentioned seeing women traveling alone. He would locate these women at gas stations, disable their vehicles with sugar in the gas tank, a method that causes engine failure 10 to 15 miles down the road but leaves no immediately obvious evidence of tampering. When their vehicles stalled, usually in isolated areas, he would drive the same route shortly after, discover the stranded motorist, and offer assistance. Those who accepted his help disappeared. Those who refused to get in his truck or who managed to flag down other motorists before he could isolate them were the ones who later reported swerving to avoid a man standing in the road. He would return to those locations, position himself in the roadway, hoping they would stop or lose control, giving him another opportunity. The women he successfully abducted were taken to the shipping container on his property. He kept them alive for 3 to 7 days, viewing them as entertainment between his long-haul routes. When he had a scheduled run, he would kill them and bury them in shallow graves in the woods surrounding the container. He spoke about this with detached rationality, explaining that the timing had to align with his work schedule, that he could not risk keeping them longer and missing deliveries that would raise questions. 2 victims were never recovered. Joshua refused to disclose their burial locations, claiming those were his insurance policy for future appeals or sentence negotiations. Investigators searched hundreds of acres around his property with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, but found only the 7 graves he had already admitted to. The trial lasted 3 months. Joshua showed no remorse, treated the proceedings like an inconvenience interrupting his schedule. When the prosecution presented evidence of the suffering he had caused, the years of anguish for families who had not known what happened to their daughters and sisters and mothers, he appeared bored. His only emotional response came when they discussed seizing his truck and property. He objected to that, claiming they were taking his livelihood without just cause. He was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of kidnapping for the victims whose bodies were never found. The jury recommended the death penalty. He currently sits on death row at Pontiac Correctional Center, filing appeal after appeal, occasionally offering hints about the location of the final 2 victims in exchange for sentence reduction. The families of those 2 women live in terrible limbo, knowing their loved ones are dead but unable to bring them home for burial. I still work in traffic analysis, but I do it from my home office now. I requested a transfer to remote work status shortly after the trial ended, citing personal reasons. My supervisor approved without question, probably relieved not to have to discuss the case that had consumed our department for months. I cannot drive Highway 146 anymore. I tried once about a year after Joshua's conviction, thinking I needed to reclaim that route, to prove to myself it was just a road again. I made it about 8 miles before I had to pull over, hands shaking, heart racing, unable to continue. Every mile marker felt like a grave site. Every wide spot on the shoulder looked like a place where someone's car had stalled, where they had made the fatal decision to trust someone who offered help. The data still haunts me. 17 accidents that were not really accidents. 9 disappearances that formed a pattern no one noticed because they were spread across time and jurisdictions and case files that never communicated with each other. 7 confirmed murders and 2 more that we know happened but cannot prove without bodies. And the terrible question that keeps me awake: how many other highways have their own predators? How many other stretches of rural road where the accident reports and missing persons cases would tell a story if someone just knew how to read the numbers? I analyze traffic data now, looking for patterns that might indicate something worse than poor road design. I search for demographic clusters that do not make statistical sense, for accident reports that share suspicious similarities, for gaps in the data that might represent people who never made it to their destinations. My colleagues think I have become obsessed, that I see conspiracy in ordinary tragedy. Maybe they are right. Maybe Joshua was an anomaly, a statistical outlier himself, and most roads are just roads where random accidents happen. But I keep finding patterns, small ones, incomplete ones, threads that might connect to nothing or might connect to another person like Joshua, who has learned to hunt in plain sight, disguised as a helpful stranger, as someone who stops to assist a motorist in distress. The data tells stories if you know how to listen. I learned that lesson from Highway 146, from 17 women who swerved to avoid a man who should not have been standing there, from 9 women who accepted help from the wrong person, from 7 shallow graves in the woods behind a shipping container. Numbers do not lie. They accumulate, they form patterns, they reveal truths that remain invisible until someone looks at them from the right angle. That is what I do now. I look for patterns, and when I find them, I make sure someone listens before another dot appears on another map, another data point representing someone who drove down the wrong stretch of highway at the wrong time and crossed paths with someone who was waiting for exactly that moment. Student Welfare Report, Heron Elementary School, October 2015. I am Madison Bryant, school counselor, and I have worked in this district for 9 years. Part of my role involves identifying children who may be experiencing difficulties at home, watching for changes in behavior that signal abuse or neglect or family crisis. When 3 siblings from the same family exhibited identical behavioral changes within the same 2-week period, protocol required I investigate the home situation. What I discovered was not neglect or abuse in any traditional sense. It was systematic psychological conditioning by parents who genuinely believed they were preparing their children for salvation, and a leader who knew exactly how to exploit parental fear and turn it into something monstrous. The Bryant children, ages 6, 8, and 11, had been normal students until mid-October. Active in class, social with peers, participated in all school activities without issue. Then something shifted. All three became withdrawn simultaneously. They stopped eating lunch, leaving their trays untouched. They refused to participate in the upcoming Halloween celebrations, asking to be excused from any classroom activities involving the holiday. When other children celebrated birthdays with cupcakes, the Bryant siblings would not join, sitting silently while their classmates sang and ate cake. The changes were too synchronized to be coincidental. I scheduled a meeting with the parents, Matthew and Victoria, who arrived dressed conservatively and carrying Bibles. They were polite but firm when I expressed concern about their children's sudden withdrawal from normal activities. They explained the family had recently joined a new church, Unity Church of Southern Illinois, and were following what they described as purification protocols to prepare for significant upcoming spiritual events. When I pressed for details about what these protocols involved, they became evasive. They mentioned the children were learning discipline and focus, that worldly distractions needed to be eliminated, that comfort and pleasure were obstacles to spiritual readiness. I asked if the children were being fed adequately. Victoria assured me they ate every day, though she acknowledged the diet was simple. Bread and water primarily, to teach them humility and reduce their attachment to physical satisfaction. I filed a report with Child Protective Services that afternoon. A home visit was conducted within 48 hours. What the caseworker found technically did not meet the legal threshold for removal, but it painted a disturbing picture. The children slept on thin mats on the floor of a single room, no beds, no pillows. Their toys and books had been removed except for religious materials written by the church leader. They spent 3 hours each morning before school in what the parents called prayer meditation, which appeared to be extended periods of kneeling in silence. Meals consisted of plain bread and water, occasionally supplemented with vegetables but no meat or processed foods. The caseworker documented everything but concluded the children were not in immediate danger. They were clothed, sheltered, and technically fed. The parents were not physically abusive. Without clear evidence of harm, there was no legal basis for intervention. But she recommended ongoing monitoring, and I was asked to keep watch at school for any escalation. I began researching Unity Church. It operated out of an abandoned church building near Lake of Egypt, a structure that had been decommissioned in the 1980s and sat vacant for years before someone calling himself Daniel Hughes took over the lease. Daniel had a background in psychology, a graduate student who had never completed his doctorate but had studied enough to understand conditioning and manipulation techniques. He had founded Unity Church in 2012 initially as a small Bible study group, then gradually evolved it into something more controlling. The church had approximately 30 members, 11 families with children. All the families shared similar stories, recent tragedies, financial hardships, feelings of being lost or purposeless. Daniel had specifically recruited people who were vulnerable, who needed answers and structure and someone to tell them how to make sense of suffering. He offered them certainty in exchange for obedience. His theology centered on an imminent end times event he called the harvesting. According to Daniel, God would soon judge the world, and only those who had achieved complete spiritual purity would survive. Children, he preached, were naturally closer to purity than adults, but they needed to be protected from corrupting influences. Television, toys, processed food, holiday celebrations, friendships with non-believers, all of these were contaminations that would prevent them from being chosen during the harvesting. He set a specific date, December 21, 2015. On that day, he told his congregation, "The pure would be taken and the impure would be left behind." Parents became consumed with ensuring their children made the cut. They followed increasingly extreme protocols Daniel prescribed. Dietary restrictions, sleep deprivation masked as extended prayer, sensory isolation to remove worldly distractions, repetitive memorization of Daniel's teachings. The children at school became shadows of themselves. They stopped speaking unless spoken to. They avoided eye contact. The 11-year-old, normally bright and engaged, began falling asleep at her desk from exhaustion. When I gently asked her if everything was okay at home, she recited what was clearly a rehearsed answer. "I am being prepared. I am becoming pure. I will be ready when the time comes." I escalated my concerns to CPS again, this time with documentation from multiple teachers and the school nurse. We were building a case, but these things take time, require evidence of specific harm, cannot move forward based solely on religious practices parents have the right to impose. Meanwhile, December 21st was approaching, and I had a growing fear that Daniel's end times prophecy involved more than just spiritual preparation. An anonymous tip reached the police department on December 14th. Someone from inside the church, perhaps a member who had begun questioning the increasingly extreme measures, reported that Daniel was planning a final purification ceremony for the children. The tip mentioned that the ceremony would ensure the children crossed over pure, that it involved a locked room and a method to help them transcend their physical bodies. Police raided Unity Church on December 15th. They found 14 children, including the 3 Bryant siblings, dressed in white ceremonial robes, gathered in a back room that had been sealed with plastic sheeting over the windows and door. In the corner sat a portable generator connected to a crude ventilation system that, when reversed, would pump carbon monoxide into the sealed space instead of fresh air. Daniel was arrested immediately. His journal, recovered from a desk in his office, laid out the entire plan. He believed that if the children died in a state of spiritual purity, they would be guaranteed salvation and would trigger the larger harvesting event. His own survival, he wrote, would prove he was the chosen prophet meant to lead the next phase of God's plan. All 14 children were removed from their families and placed in emergency protective custody. Psychiatric evaluations revealed varying degrees of trauma and indoctrination. Some children were relieved to be removed, quickly beginning to recover once they were fed properly and allowed to sleep. Others were devastated, believing they had failed a critical spiritual test, convinced they had doomed themselves and their parents by not completing the ceremony. The parents faced a terrible reckoning. Most had genuinely believed they were saving their children's souls, that Daniel was guiding them toward salvation. When confronted with evidence that he had planned to kill their children, many broke down completely, unable to reconcile their faith in his teachings with the reality of what almost happened. Some parents remained in denial for months, insisting the police had misunderstood Daniel's intentions. Daniel was convicted on 14 counts of child endangerment and conspiracy to commit murder. He received 45 years. At sentencing, he showed no remorse, maintaining that his actions were divinely inspired and that the children would have thanked him for saving them from the coming judgment. He predicted that those present would regret interrupting his work when the harvesting came, and they found themselves among the unprepared. The parents were offered plea deals in exchange for participation in deprogramming therapy. Most accepted and eventually regained custody of their children after demonstrating they had broken free from Daniel's influence. A few families never reunited, the damage too extensive to repair. I left school counseling after Unity Church. I could not continue working with children in that setting. Could not walk those hallways without seeing the Bryant siblings as they had been in October, their light dimming day by day as their parents prepared them for a salvation that was actually an execution. I moved to private practice, specializing in cult survivors and religious trauma, working with adults who are trying to understand how they were manipulated into harming the people they loved most. What haunts me about Unity Church is not Daniel's manipulation, though that was sophisticated and deliberate. What haunts me is how easily loving parents became instruments of potential murder in the name of protection. They were not evil people. They were frightened people who met someone with answers, someone who understood how to weaponize their fear and turn their love into something deadly. Belief is the most powerful force in human psychology, and in the wrong hands it becomes the perfect tool for destruction. Those children survived, most of them, but some still wake up afraid of failing tests they no longer consciously remember. Still carry guilt about not being pure enough. Still struggle with the message that their parents' love was conditional on spiritual performance. That is Daniel's real legacy. Not the crime that was prevented, but the wounds that will take lifetimes to heal. Southern Illinois Entries, 2012 through 2016. I am Detective Victoria Long with the Williamson County Sheriff's Office, assigned to missing persons and cold cases. The official records will tell you I closed 23 files in a single year and brought answers to 23 families who thought they would never know what happened to the people they loved. That part is true. What the records do not show is the way it happened, or how one old house, one hidden room, and 23 silent watches convinced me that some obsessions are more dangerous than any weapon. It started, like a lot of things do in this line of work, with something that should have been routine. An elderly woman died without a will in a small town outside Marion. No next of kin, no one to claim the house or its contents. The county scheduled an estate inventory and eventual auction, the kind of administrative process that usually never crosses my desk. The only reason it landed with me is because the property records listed a previous owner whose name I recognized, Matthew Cooper. Matthew had been a person of interest in a few minor fraud investigations years back. Nothing that stuck. Hot checks, questionable title transfers, a pattern of skating on the edge of the law without leaving enough evidence to justify charges. He had sold the house to the woman who died, but there was a 3-month gap in the paperwork where technically the place had been his again before the sale fully processed. That might not sound like much. To me, it sounded like an opportunity for someone like him to leave something behind. The estate contractor called me the day the crew started clearing out the basement. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness in it I have learned not to ignore. "Detective, I think you might want to see this yourself," he said. "We found a room that is not on the plans." The house was an ordinary one-story structure from the 50s. Nothing about it screamed secrets. The basement was half-finished, half-storage, low ceiling, exposed pipes. At the far end, behind what had looked like a built-in shelving unit, someone had paneled over a doorway. The backs of the shelves were thin plywood nailed into studs. When the crew removed a section to see what was behind it, they found a narrow door. No knob, just a recessed handle like you might see on a utility closet. Inside was a room about 10 feet by 8, no windows. Bare concrete floor, a single bulb in the ceiling. And along the back wall, mounted with meticulous precision, were 23 small wooden hooks. Hanging from each hook was a wristwatch. They were all different styles. Some cheap digital ones, some mid-range analog, one or two that had clearly cost more than most people's rent. Each watch had a paper tag attached with masking tape. On each tag, written in that small controlled block handwriting that never betrays emotion, was a name and a date. Underneath the date on every tag was a time written down to the minute. I knew some of those names before I even finished the first row. Isaac disappeared from his car on the way home from a night shift in 2012. Jenny, last seen leaving a supermarket in 2013. Tyler vanished while walking from his job site to the bus stop in 2014. These were my people, my open files. Their faces had been staring at me from the corkboard in my office for years. Every watch was stopped, not dead from old age or drained batteries. Every watch had been deliberately set and then halted at the exact time written on its tag. Some read 1842, some 0311. One I noticed read 0010, the hands pinned straight up. That tag bore the name of a 17-year-old who had gone missing on New Year's Eve. There was a small metal folding table against the side wall. On it were 3 spiral notebooks, stacked neatly. Each cover was labeled with a range of years: 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, and blank. I flipped open the first one and understood within seconds that we were not dealing with trophies in the way serial predators usually keep them. These were something else. These were logs. Each victim had a section, the name at the top, the date they disappeared. Beneath that, pages of notes as detailed as any surveillance report I have ever written. Routes to work, favorite gas stations, what time they usually left their house, whether they jaywalked or used crosswalks. Which friends they met regularly and which ones they avoided. The time they tended to check their phones. How long they spent in the shower. When they seemed happiest, angriest, distracted. Then near the end of each section, a line drawn across the page and a new heading. Conclusion. Under that heading, the writing changed. Not the style, but the focus. It described what they were wearing on the last day. The way their voices sounded when they answered an innocuous question. The last thing they laughed at. The last text they sent. And finally, the last moment anyone else would ever see them. Subject observed at corner of Main and 4th, 1926, waiting for walk signal. Right foot tapping. Jaw clenching between swallows. Hands in pockets despite mild temperature. Conclusion point optimal. 1932-10. It went on like that for 23 people. We got a warrant for full forensic processing of the property within the hour. The elderly woman who had owned the house most recently was cleared quickly. She had moved in after all the disappearances, had no obvious connection to any of the victims. Her death had been from natural causes. The time gap I had noticed in the sale record suddenly looked like exactly what it was. A window where Matthew had access and motive to build himself a shrine to endings. While the evidence techs worked the hidden room, I dug into every record I could find on Matthew Cooper. Born in southern Illinois, worked a string of forgettable jobs: warehouse, short order cook, janitorial. Never married, no children, no military or higher education. The only arrest on his record was a bar fight in his 20s. The fraud allegations had never gone anywhere. The one constant in his history was time. His employment record showed an obsession with punctuality. He never clocked in late, never left early. Former supervisors described him as reliable to the minute and unsettlingly aware of the clock. He had once filed a formal complaint when a manager changed the wall clock by 3 minutes without telling anyone. Old neighbors remembered him walking the neighborhood at the same times every day. Same routes, same duration. A woman who had lived next door to him as a child mentioned in a shaky interview that he had a twin brother who died when they were teenagers. Car accident. The story went that the brother had been running late that night and took a different route than usual. When we finally picked Matthew up, it was not dramatic. No chase, no standoff. He was living alone in a small rental outside Carterville. He opened the door, saw the uniforms, and just sighed like someone whose bus had finally arrived. "I figured you would get around to it," he said. "Once she died and someone went through the house. How many did you find?" I asked him why he had done it before I asked him how. Some part of me needed to know what kind of internal logic could drive someone to kill 23 people and hang their watches on a wall. He tilted his head, studying me with a clinical curiosity that made my skin crawl. "Everyone thinks their life is a story," he said. "Beginning, middle, end. They talk like they can feel the arc of it. But stories are fiction. Real lives are messy. No structure, no symmetry. That bothered me." He explained in a voice that never rose above polite conversation level that he had become obsessed with the idea of conclusion points. Moments when a person's life, as a continuous narrative, became fixed in retrospect. The last time they did something ordinary with no idea it was the last. Last cup of coffee, last commute, last bored glance at a clock. "Once the moment is past," he said, "you can rewind and see the pattern, but the person living it never gets to." I wanted to stand at that threshold, to hold that last minute still. His method was simple, which somehow made it worse. He watched people, not at random. He picked those whose routines were painfully consistent, whose lives ran like clockwork. The ones who took the same bus every day, bought the same groceries every week, left work at the same time down to the minute. He memorized their patterns, tested his predictions against their reality. When he could predict their movement within a window of less than 60 seconds, he considered them ready. The abductions were quick, opportunistic, and carefully timed. A van pulling up the second someone stepped into a quiet alley. A hand over the mouth as they unlocked a car door in a dark lot. A taser strike at the exact second a train roared past an overpass, masking any sound. He kept them for exactly 24 hours, not more, not less. The notebooks detailed those days in excruciating detail, what they said when they woke up, how long they cried, what questions they asked when they realized they were not going home. He did not torture them in the physical sense. There were no marks on the bodies that suggested prolonged sadism. What he did instead was talk. He would ask them to recount their last normal day, what time they woke up, whether they hit the snooze button, what they ate for breakfast, who they spoke to, what song was on the radio on their way to work. He recorded everything, building a complete picture of that final unnoticed day. At the exact minute that matched the time written on their watch tag, 24 hours after he had taken them, he killed them. Method varied. Strangulation, a knife, occasionally a blunt object. But timing never did. The moment mattered more to him than the method. "The watch stops there," he said, tapping the table in the interview room. "That is the point where the narrative freezes. Everyone else's memory of them stops a day earlier. I am the only one who knows the true conclusion." We found the graves on a wooded parcel of land outside Crail Springs that he had inherited from his parents. 23 shallow graves arranged in a rough circle, each marked underground by a simple metal stake. There were no headstones, no names, just the bodies and their stories preserved in his notebooks and watches. The forensic work took months. DNA, dental records, careful excavation. One by one, we matched the remains to the names on my board. The families came in, some after years of not knowing, to hear what had happened. We had to decide case by case and how much to tell them. Most got the broad strokes. He watched, he abducted, he killed. Only a few got the details about the watches, about their loved ones' last days being documented in obsessive detail. Matthew never asked for mercy. He did not cry. In court, he listened to victim impact statements with the same detached focus he had used to watch people from across parking lots and bus stops. He pleaded guilty on all counts to avoid a drawn-out trial, life without parole. The last notebook, the one with 2016 on the cover and nothing written inside, bothered me more than it should have. When I asked him about it, he smiled faintly. "That one was for me," he said. I was getting older. Patterns slip. Memory goes. I thought maybe I would like someone to mark my conclusion point too. 3 months after his sentencing, when a hiker found human remains in a ravine 3 miles from his family's land, dental records confirmed what we already suspected. It was Matthew. He had taken his own life, timed in a way we could not ignore. The medical examiner estimated the time of death down to a window of 10 minutes. His prison record showed he had been missing from count for exactly that long before guards noticed. In his cell, they found a cheap plastic wristwatch on his pillow. It had stopped. The time on its face matched the estimate of his death. The tag taped to it did not say his full name. Just M. Cooper and a time, nothing more. I still work missing persons. Still stare at boards full of faces and timelines, but I check timestamps differently now. I pay attention to the small coincidences. The co-worker who always leaves 2 minutes late on the day they vanish. The bus that is exactly 3 minutes behind schedule before someone is last seen. I know most of it is just noise. Most people live and die without anyone ever marking their conclusion point. But somewhere in my mind, there is a hidden room with its own hooks and its own watches, and I cannot stop hearing Matthew's voice saying he wanted to stand at the threshold between ordinary days and the moment everything ends. We took his notebooks. We buried his victims. We closed 23 cases. What we did not close is the question his obsession left behind. How many other people look at the clock not to see what is coming next, but to decide when something will end forever?